Bonsoir, merci de votre présence. Merci à Mark Zeitoun d'avoir fait une halte au Luxembourg. Nous sommes très contents de pouvoir aborder ce sujet très important qui est la question de l'eau. Nous remercions nos différents partenaires. Si vous avez le petit flyer, donc vous verrez que nous avons plusieurs partenaires qui se sont associés à nous, comme natur&ëmwelt, l'ASTM et aussi d'autres. Ce qui est important pour nous, c'est vraiment de voir le conflit israélo-palestinien dans son entièreté, dans ce qu'il a aussi de symbolique. La question de l'eau se pose dans beaucoup de conflits, comme la question de la terre et d'autres. Donc le déroulement de cette soirée, Moh va introduire Mark Zeitoun, qui aura 45-50 minutes pour présenter donc, son sujet. Nous aurons ensuite largement le temps de questions-réponses. Et je vous invite à rester après les questions-réponses pour plusieurs actions. La première action, pour ceux qui acceptent d'être pris en photo, nous aurons une petite photo de groupe, car il y a au mois de mai le Giro d'Italie qui part de Jérusalem. Donc les Italiens font une grosse action pour dénoncer, en fait c'est une opération de marketing d'Israël qui prend en charge financièrement ce Giro d'Italie et donc le reçoit à bras ouverts, et ce qui donne bien sûr une image très touristique, favorable, sportive d'Israël. Donc on continue à laver l'occupation, que ce soit dans le sport, que ce soit dans la pseudo-ouverture aux gays et lesbiennes. Donc voilà, pour ceux qui sont d'accord que leurs photos soient reprises sur Facebook ou ailleurs, donc on fera cette petite photo. Ensuite, nous pourrons descendre à Le Kosof pour le verre de l'amitié. Ah non, c'est ici. Pardon, merci Nathalie. Donc nous pourrons rester à cet étage pour le verre de l'amitié que nous avons le plaisir de vous offrir afin de continuer de manière informelle. Pour ceux qui ne le reçoivent pas encore, vous pouvez vous inscrire sur notre liste ici auprès d'Anna Maria au stand pour la lettre info. Et ceux qui veulent devenir membres peuvent aussi devenir membres pour la somme modique de 15 €. Voilà, je vous remercie. Ah oui, pardon. Je voulais quand même, pour ceux qui n'ont peut-être pas encore eu l'occasion de regarder la presse, c'est une journée un petit peu particulière parce que nous avons annoncé par un communiqué de presse ce matin que nous allions faire une action en justice à l'encontre du député Fernand Kartheiser, car il nous a accusés d'être antisémites lors d'un débat à la Chambre le 5 décembre dernier et que nous estimons que c'est absolument inacceptable. Et que ces accusations d'antisémitisme servent en fait à faire taire le mouvement de solidarité avec la Palestine et à éviter ce qu'on va faire ce soir. C'est-à-dire que ce soir, on va parler des faits, on va parler des réalités. Qu'est-ce que c'est que la colonisation? Qu'est-ce que c'est que l'occupation? Et là, on pourra avoir un vrai débat. Alors que, bien sûr, si on met une étiquette antisémite, radicaux, extrémistes, le débat est terminé. Voilà, je vous remercie.
Donc, avant de passer la parole à Mark, je vais brièvement l'introduire. Donc, Mark Zeitoun est professeur à l'University of East Anglia en Angleterre et il est aussi chercheur auprès du London Water Research Group. De formation, il est ingénieur en génie civil et en sciences de l'environnement. Il a fait ses études à la McGill University où il est aujourd'hui professeur adjoint. Dans ses recherches académiques, Mark analyse les rapports de force entre acteurs politiques à travers la gestion de l'eau. Il s'est spécialisé dans la gestion transfrontalière de l'eau dans des zones de conflit ou de post-conflit, avec un accent sur le Moyen-Orient et l'Afrique. Tandis qu'on reproche souvent aux universitaires de vivre dans une tour d'ivoire, on ne peut pas dire de même de Mark Zeitoun, qui a travaillé sur le champ dans plusieurs zones de conflit, notamment au Tchad, au Liban et aussi en Palestine. Et voilà, il se penche de plus près sur la dimension hydrique du conflit israélo-palestinien dans son livre qui s'appelle « Power, Water in the Middle East, The Hidden Politics of the Palestinian-Israeli Water Conflict », qui est paru en 2008. Et comme le titre l'indique déjà, Mark identifie la gestion de l'eau comme une constituante majeure du conflit israélo-palestinien. Et 10 ans après la publication de son livre, la situation n'a pas changé, ou si elle a changé, c'est plutôt pour le pire. Donc je vais maintenant passer la parole à Mark. Sa présentation durera à peu près 40 minutes. Comme Martine l'a déjà indiqué, il y aura des questions-réponses après que vous pourriez poser ou bien en anglais ou bien en luxembourgeois, allemand, français. Voilà, luxembourgeois, allemand, français, j'essaierai de traduire. Pour ceux qui ne parlent pas l'anglais, il y a des casques ici, il y aura une traduction simultanée. Donc, voilà. Marc.
Okay. Merci Moh, merci Martine, merci toute la comité. Vous m'excusez de vous adresser en anglais. Malgré le fait que je suis canadien, j'ai perdu presque tout mon français. Habitant là en Angleterre comme je l'habite maintenant, il ne parle qu'une langue là-bas. So I'll continue in English with your permission. I've lost all my French. And I should just add a little bit to my background. Much of what I'm going to say today also comes from my experience working as an advisor to the negotiation support team. So the negotiation support unit that was organized to help the Palestinians with the 5 final status issue files, of which water was one. So from 2003 till 2010, I was advising the negotiations team in the negotiations with Israel. And you'll see some of that reflected in my talk today. So I'm going to, first of all, introduce you to the water, the actual physical resource, and then look at the roots and the future of the conflict. And then I'm going to reflect a little bit on water, how water is used as a political tool. So first of all, the river itself. 5 states are involved. The river runs southwards, so with 3 tributaries in Lebanon, in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, and in Israel. It flows into the Lake of Tiberias, which is also known as the Sea of Galilee or Lake Kinneret, depending on your belief structure. And then the lower Jordan River, which is joined by the Yarmouk River and flows to the Dead Sea. So 5 political entities, with the West Bank and Gaza now officially the state of Palestine. This is one of the sources in Lebanon drawn by this very intrepid explorer, John McGregor, a Scottish explorer who would go and in very Orientalist fashion discover new areas, people who have been living there for thousands of years, but did a good job drawing the surroundings. Here in southern Lebanon, where the Hasbani tributary to the Jordan River starts. So the water then flows from the, northwards. Here I'm looking eastwards over the occupied Golan and the Lake of Tiberias, and then it flows out through here. And at the mouth of Tiberias, I don't know if anyone's been there, but that's the site, it's claimed to be, that's the site where Jesus was baptized. The actual site is actually further down. There's a tiny placard that says it's not actually here, but it's further down in the part of the river that is actually dry. And the river is dry because of this tiny dam, which was built in 1964 just to regulate the level of the Lake of Tiberias for abstraction of drinking water for the state of Israel, primarily for the state of Israel. I'll get more into the details in a minute. And then, of course, at the tail end of the river, it comes to the lowest body of water on the planet, the Dead Sea. So the Dead Sea, there is very little that lives in it. It's this unique chemical composition. So it's dead in the sense that nothing really lives in it, and it's also dying even more because there's less and less water reaching it. And so it's evaporating and reducing all the time. This hotel, this window used to be a hotel that was built right on the shore of the lake some 30 years ago, inside the West Bank. Okay, so that's the water. Now, the roots of the conflict go way back. There's a fantastic book, a fantastic documentation of an American expedition to the Holy Land to collect holy water, which was then brought back to Kentucky in these barrels. It shows you, I mean, the holy aspect of the river was the driving force there. Well, I think it was the desire to make some money based on the back of the holiness of the water that drove this impulse to acquire the water. It's if you can have a look at the photo, it's fabulous because they talk about 7 different races here: Turkish, Arab, Greek, Egyptian, Syrian, Bedouin, and American. And it's fun to try to spot the different races. So the water was bottled and sold like this, and it's still being bottled and sold like that. You can buy holy water. So that's small water. That's not really the main water conflict, but it gives you an idea just how some people view the resources. Thinking more about the political history, I should say that I'm firmly of the belief that the water conflict is part of the bigger Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I don't think it's the driver of the conflict. I think it's a subset of the bigger political issues, which is the land in Jerusalem. But I think it's an important one. But it's certainly not the main driver. The main driver is the land and the acquisition and the chauvinism, the chauvinistic attitudes that make the territory for one people and not for another people. But so the political history is important for the water conflict, of course. So if, it was an Ottoman colony at one point, and then a British colony up until 1948. From 1948 till 1967. This part became Israel, and the West Bank was part of Jordan, and Gaza was part of Egypt. And Syria still had all of the Golan. Of course, after 1967, Israel occupied the Golan, the West Bank, and Gaza. If you drop the water resources on top of that, the river flows through all this fractured political territory. And there are 2 main agreements that determine which state gets how much water. The first one is the 1994 Jordan-Israel Peace Treaty, where Jordan and Israel agreed in a very complicated treaty that I've been studying in some detail, exactly who should get how much. A lot of that has to do with the Yarmouk River. And at that point, the Palestinians weren't represented in those negotiations, and so they don't figure into that peace treaty, of course. But it meant that a lot of that water was already locked up. The allocation of the river was already locked up by the time the Palestinians started negotiating. The 1995 Oslo II Agreement, which was signed between the State of Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, was only over the aquifers, so these transboundary aquifers. Because the river had already been allocated between Jordan and Israel, the only water left to be negotiated was these aquifers. So I'll point them out. The Western Aquifer, which is by far the most productive, in the sense that you can get water relatively easily. You just have to drill 50 or 100 meters into the ground, and it's good quality fresh water. The Northeastern Aquifer, where you have to drill, well, we drilled, when I was working for USAID, we drilled a well that was 500 meters deep. It was so deep that it was very difficult to get the water up, out, and into the city of Jenin. Technically, it was very difficult. The well, the pumps keep breaking down. And then the Eastern Aquifer, where the water is usually so deep and so salty that it's extremely hard to develop. And so this is the way the Palestinians used to get groundwater, from wells. Either the women would carry it out, or the donkeys would pump it out. This is the way we get water out of the ground these days. So this is one of those, this is a motor that drives a pump that could be 200 or 300 meters down into the ground. It pumps the water back up, out of the ground, out of the aquifer, and then along this pipe to whoever gets the water. In this case, it's going to an Israeli settlement, of course, and this is inside the West Bank. This was in the 1990s, and it's a little bit more fortified now. The Oslo II Agreement came up with this very complicated distribution, which gave essentially, which locked in the status quo in 1995, after so many 20-something years of occupation. the Palestinians agreed to this allocation that was supposed to be renegotiated in 2000, 5 years afterwards. And that allocation was what was existing at the time, which means 94% of the good aquifer to Israel, 71% of the medium aquifer to Israel, and 42% of the eastern aquifer to Israel, meaning roughly 20% for Palestinians, 80% for Israelis. That was supposed to be renegotiated in 5 years later, in the year 2000, but it wasn't. We can talk about why and how that happened during the question and answer period, if you'd like. I'll just say a word about the coastal aquifer, especially since we have Sari Sisalem with us here, who's from Gaza and knows all about water. It's also a great aquifer, but it's been overpumped so much in Israel and so much in Gaza that now the seawater is intruding, and especially in Gaza, the demand for water with so many people in such a small area means that the salt water is intruding, the wastewater that isn't treated, the sewage from your toilets in the hospitals goes straight into the ground and seeps into the groundwater, and so it's undrinkable water quality. But the very fact that it's downstream means that it doesn't really enter into the political conflict as much as the West Bank and Gaza, because here, Palestinians from Gaza use this water with no consequence on Israel. And so Israel is not a political concern. Whereas this water is used by Israelis and Palestinians, and so that's the heart of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So I say that not to diminish the fact, or to diminish what people are living in Gaza, not at all. They're really suffering. But I'll focus mostly on the West Bank. So you've got this 80%, 20% split in the groundwater, and if you add the Jordan River, the surface water, into that, it's roughly a 90% split, 10% split, which means 1 drop in every 10 that falls in the West Bank can be used by Palestinians. And parts of the West Bank are quite wet, especially around Qalqilia and the northwestern part of the West Bank. But that rain, only 1 drop in every 10 can be used, or Palestinians actually have some control over. Crucially, this is what was agreed to by the PLO in the Oslo II agreement. And I'll come back to that. But first I want to show how this great 90%, 10% asymmetry and control over the water is manifested. You can look at it in numbers. So you've got total Israeli water consumption up around 2,000 million cubic meters per year. Israeli agricultural consumption around 1,200. Domestic consumption, which is how much you use for drinking water for your houses, even for Israel, is higher than total Palestinian consumption. Total Palestinian consumption. So all the water used by Palestinians for drinking water and agricultural water. Irrigation, which is the main source, the main consumptive use of water. Food takes a lot more water than actually washing and drinking does. So, okay, so that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is in terms of per capita consumption. So of course there are roughly twice as many Israeli people as Palestinians from Palestine. And so roughly per capita consumption, the proportion is 4 to 1. But if you look at the Israeli settlers in the West Bank, it's compared to Palestinians in the West Bank, it's about 10 to 1, 10 more times. Each Israeli, let's say, settler would have access to roughly 10 times more water than the average Palestinian. And the price paid for water is also asymmetric, of course. Palestinians who receive water from, or who buy water from Israel, pay the same price as Israeli settlers do, or Israeli citizens. They don't pay more. So they're a market for the Israeli water producers. So they pay the same price. But Israeli farmers who use a lot of water receive other subsidies that make it cheaper for them to farm. And for Palestinians who don't have piped water supplied to them either by Palestinian authorities or by Israel, in the villages, for example, there's still hundreds or dozens of villages that don't have a piped water supply. They end up buying water from cisterns that are pulled by trucks or by donkeys, which costs a lot more per cubic meter. And so that can actually rise to sometimes 30 times more than the average Israeli settler in the West Bank. So the poorest Palestinians are paying 30 times more than, in some cases, than the Israeli settlers are. Most Israeli settlers are quite well off. So there's a massive imbalance there. That's also, I study water politics around the world, and it's impressive how, you know, it's almost boring, it's almost monotonous how predictable it is. But everywhere you go, the poor pay the most for water. It's always the wealthy people in the cities usually who end up paying less. And so it's the same in Palestine, but it's got this political tint on it. Another way of looking at the asymmetry is just how you actually live with that water. So here's a picture of an Israeli settlement, livestock settlements. They produce cows and what have you, and they get their water supply from Israel from an 8-inch water pipe, which is secure and good quality water, and is clearly enough water for cheap enough price that they can produce cows and vegetation with it. The Palestinians who are in the villages behind me, their only source of water, their only piped source of water anyway, is this small 2-inch line that is exposed. It's not secure. It gets trampled upon. Even if it has water in it, it would leak. And if you could pay for it, it would cost the same amount as the water purchased here. But of course, the people in these tiny villages don't have the same capacity the same financial capacity. So it's another way of looking at the asymmetry. Or consider the farmers in the West Bank. In some areas of the West Bank, especially areas C, please, interrupt me if I'm talking about something you don't understand. But areas C being the areas more or less fully under Israeli control. So in the southern West Bank near Hebron, for example, you're not even allowed to build a cistern, you're not even allowed to catch rainwater. If you build a house here, it will get demolished. If you build something to capture rainwater, it will get demolished, unless you put an injunction to stop the demolition order, if you're very fortunate. And so Palestinians in some places in the West Bank still rely on rain-fed agriculture. And when the rains don't come, as they can't, you can't guarantee them, then you get a very poor yield. And in this year, it was 2005, it was such a poor yield that these people weren't going to recover the costs that they'd put into producing the wheat and the barsam that they were growing. So the WHO, or the World Food Program, steps in and starts distributing food, which is what the World Food Program and the humanitarian aid industry does whenever there's a drought or famine. But in this context, it's absolutely ludicrous because we're less than a couple of miles away from intensive, modern, irrigated agriculture and a very, very, very secure food supply. So this is Israeli settlement produce in the West Bank. A lot of the dates and herbs that you can see in supermarkets in Europe are grown with water, or grown on settlements in the Jordan River Valley with water that's located under the West Bank, but all of which is transboundary and taken in a 90%, 10% split. So the question then becomes, how did it become so asymmetric? And you have to understand how it became asymmetric if you want to make it a bit less asymmetric, or if you want to transform the conflict. And this is what my whole book was about. I think, Moh, Moh has a PDF copy of the book. I'm sorry, I don't have any hard copies, but if you would like a soft copy of the book, perhaps just write to Moh and he'll be able to send you one. But I looked at how power helps to explain this, how the asymmetry came about. And there are different forms of power, hard bargaining power and ideational power. A combination of the three was used to achieve the asymmetry and to maintain the asymmetry. So hard power, first of all, in 1967, one of Israel, the new occupying state of Israel inside of the West Bank, issued several military orders about how the people were going to live now, the people under their rule. And some of the very first ones were about water. No drilling orders, for example. So Palestinians were immediately, very soon, months after June 1967, were disallowed from drilling the water that's underneath their feet. During the occupation, well, the official occupation period, from 1967 until the Oslo II period, until the Oslo II agreement, Israel developed the West Bank, developed the water resources in the West Bank, sunk a lot of wells for Israeli settlements and for Palestinian villages, with the reasoning being that the Palestinian villages that were served would, well, because if it's called, some people call it a together hide, that the Israeli settlements and the Palestinian villages are so linked by roads as well as by water networks that everyone's together, so that if Palestinians were, for instance, to sabotage a pump in the West Bank or a water line in the West Bank, they'd also be sabotaging Palestinians who rely on the water. And so Israel developed water for Palestinians, but certainly with the main goal was being to further, to literally, practically, to lubricate the settlement project, the colonization of the West Bank. And then in 2001, after the complete failure of the Oslo II agreement and the re-invasion of the West Bank in 2001 in Jenin and Gaza and Nablus, all over the West Bank, lots of destruction to water infrastructure that continues to this day in the form of cisterns. So that's the hard power, that's the visible stuff, that's the sexy stuff. That's what you can see, and that's what you can photograph. Even more influential, but much less visible, is what we call ideational power. So that's the power to frame things in people's minds so that you don't question it. So that, the way Aimé Césaire talks about, servility of the blacks that was imposed by the British colonialists, or the way that Steve Biko talks about in the Black Consciousness movement, that the most potent, Steve Biko says this, most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. So if you get the people, the blacks in South Africa or the Palestinians in Palestine to believe that they can't get any better deal than what they're going to be given, that's ideational power. And so from 95 to about until today, I maintain that there is some sort of ideational power present in the form, certainly in water. When we were advising the Water Authority for their negotiations, the attitude at the time was that let's just take whatever we can get. Israel will never give us our rights, so we will talk about our needs. And Israel was proposing projects for desalination on the coast of Israel, to desalinate on the coast and then pump it to the West Bank, uphill and across Israel and uphill, which from a technical point of view is absolutely absurd, because it costs a lot to desalinate, first of all. It costs even more to pump the water uphill. And from a political perspective, it was absolutely crazy that, well, it was remarkable that the Palestinian authorities could consider such a deal, because the water that was under their feet is pumped up and pumped westwards, and they're agreeing now to take water that's manufactured on the coast and pumped eastwards. So there are certainly more efficient ways of getting water to the people, like using the water where it's located, for example. But the Palestinian Authority was the Palestinian water, well, the water negotiators at that time were beholden to this ideational power. I say this not lightly. I say it as someone who is on the inside. I say it also as a Palestinian, that there was this sort of enslavement mentality amongst the Palestinian Authority to take whatever we are offered, rather than to demand rights or to base the positions on international law, international water law, for example. So there was some ideational power, certainly. It certainly is important amongst some of the key Palestinian decision makers to this day. And then there's bargaining power. That's a power that comes from being in some sort of relationship. And this is probably the most influential aspect of power in water in Palestine and Israel. It's manifested mostly through the Joint Water Committee, so the JWC, which is an agreement, a committee that takes Palestinian technical people and Israeli technical people, and then Palestinian political people and Israeli political people, and then also Israeli military people, but not Palestinian military people. And the committee was originally hailed as a great achievement. Look, water can bring peace. Technicians we're going and measuring the depth of the water in the wells and doing all the technical stuff that is necessary if you want to manage water resources properly. But because of the jurisdiction of the Joint Water Committee, which is only in the West Bank and not in Israel, it's actually a very coercive committee. So if, for instance, Palestinians want to build a water network between Jenin and Nablus, let's say, then they need the approval of the Israeli technical people and political people and military people at the Joint Water Committee. So the technical people could approve it if it's well designed. The political people won't approve it unless it matches with what the segregation of the West Bank. And the military people won't approve it unless it matches their if it doesn't contradict their military interests. For instance, it doesn't pass through a training zone or a firing zone. But some projects do get approved. But at the political level, often some projects are blocked and there's some trading that's going on, because then Israelis also table projects for settlements in the West Bank at the Joint Water Committee. So to supply a new settlement with water, for instance, they need Palestinian political approval. Palestinians say, no way, we don't recognize the legitimacy of settlements. They're against all international law, etc. And it's an official Palestinian position not to recognize settlements, so we can't approve this water project. And the Israelis say, well, then we can't approve this other project that we would have otherwise approved. So it's a veto that from which only one side really suffers. Inevitably, or usually, the Palestinian side ends up capitulating, because they have legitimacy issues of their own, of course, the Palestinian Authority with the people. They want to get water to the people. And so it's what Jan Selby, who's a very, very good analyst, you should read some of his papers. He calls it dressing up domination as cooperation. And later, taking a very good look at the minutes of the Joint Water Committee, he says it's the PA, the Palestinian Authority, consenting to their very own colonization. And that word consent is absolutely crucial for understanding how things work. If there wasn't consent, it would be resistance. But it's not resistance, not from the Palestinian Authority anyway. So that's the situation today. We still have the Joint Water Committee. Palestinians are still not allowed to drill in the Western Aquifer and still have trouble getting water out of any of the other aquifers. Where are we going? Well, if you want to transform the conflict, there are a number of different options. We'll look at each one of these. So negotiations, first of all. Well, okay, now let's think about the current context, first of all. Now, this destruction of cisterns continues. The groundwater quality in Gaza has long been a mess, but the groundwater quality in the West Bank now is dropping for the first time ever. Usually it's been very good quality, very, very nice water. But it's so deep and it's so well protected that it hasn't been contaminated. But now it's starting to be contaminated from a number of different sources on the surface. And every hydrogeologist will tell you that by the time we discover contamination so deep and so long in getting there, it's too late to do anything about it. We have a Palestinian state that's been created since the time of this most of this analysis. And we've got a Palestinian Authority that has some authority over some parts of the West Bank and practically none over Gaza. And there was a new water law created by the Palestinian Water Authority in 2014, which I can talk a bit more about if you'd like. In Israel, there's the very impressive technological developments that Israel has done, like drip irrigation and remineralization of desalinated water. That kind of thing is being exported around the world. Israel has a reputation of being on top of things from a technical perspective for water. There's been new master plan for water infrastructure for West Bank settlements. There's increasing levels of wastewater reuse, so this high-tech solution of reusing treated waste for agriculture. I think 60% of the water waste in Israel is reused for irrigation, which is extremely impressive, the highest in the world. And then there's desalination. So this, what was once too expensive, is now an option. And Israel is actually desalinating well over 400 million cubic meters per year, which is more than total Palestinian consumption, which suggests that there might be less pressure on the fresh water and therefore an ability or a rationale for reaching an agreement over the fresh water. Well, that's what the negotiations tried to do. This is how I've tracked the negotiations. I put them moving from right to left, not because it's a presentation about an Arabic part of the world, but because I think they're going backwards. You know, Madrid started off well, but it was quickly subsumed by the Oslo process, and then the roadmap, if you remember George Bush's time. The Americans, of course, are driving this process. So Annapolis was George Bush's last attempt before Obama came around. And then it was survival diplomacy for the Palestinian Authority, and statehood, which was heralded as quite an accomplishment for the Palestinians at the time. They have their seat at the United Nations now. Currently, right now, there are next to no negotiations, except that the Joint Water Committee is still meeting, and so there are informal negotiations still over water. But the basis for negotiations, the one that we were advising for, could have been, there were several potential bases for negotiations. You could either continue the existing agreement, or you could try to improve the cooperation, which was the official Israeli position. You could talk about minimum water requirements, or you could base your position on international water law, which was the official Palestinian position, the position that we had recommended and that was taken up as the official Palestinian position. So breaking that ideational power, saying, no, we should base our Palestinian claim for water on what is called, on the legal entitlement for water. And I can go in at great length into international water law if you want, but it's essentially the UN Water Courses Convention of 1997, which says that all water that is transboundary should be distributed in an equitable and reasonable manner. And that division is based on the number of people dependent on the population, on the water, as well as on a number of alternative water sources and 5 other factors. So that was the official Palestinian position, but the Israeli position was quite different. So to what extent have the negotiations been useful? I mean, have they achieved anything? And if they have been useful, for whom? I quit the advising the negotiations in 2010 because I thought it was just a fig leaf for the continued colonization of the West Bank. It provided a cover of legitimacy, which looked hopeful if the negotiations were being done in good faith. But if they're not being done in good faith, then it's time to call them off. But they continued right up until recently. Ziad Klo said it best. I think that the end of the Palestinian state was predicted even before it officially became a state. It's well worth a read, this one. Okay, so if negotiations aren't working, what about legal advocacy? Well, there are a number of different legal routes that can be taken. There's this international water law, which we can look into. There's international humanitarian law, or the rules of war. That there's violations of just looking at the agreement between the two sides and catalog them. Steve McCaffrey did catalog them. He's a special rapporteur from the International Law Commission. He said there were many minor violations from the Palestinian side, and the violations are systematic and major on the Israeli side. Or there's a human right of water, human right to water, of course. And so legal campaigns, I think, can be effective precisely because they're legitimate around the world, certainly in a forum like this. They have a certain legitimacy that won't be killed off even in the current trend nationally to revert to, internationally to revert to nationalism. I don't think it's going to be killed off. It's just not very popular right now, but it will come back. But to promote a legal campaign without a political campaign means there's a lot less traction. So there needs to be a political campaign as well. Political campaigns, which doesn't exist right now from the Palestinian Authority. So apart from legal advocacy, there's also just communications advocacy, trying to raise awareness, public awareness of the situation, like what we're doing tonight. There are dozens, possibly over 100 reports written on the water situation. Nobody will contest any of the figures that I just gave you. It's extremely well documented, extremely well documented, from all different forms, from conservative institutions to activist institutions. There's very little disagreement about this. There are also very many great infographics that more or less capture everything I've said in a single image. So we can't say we didn't know. We know. And it doesn't take much effort to get to know the situation. All the people who go and work for the UN, all the mediators, everybody is aware of this information. But how far can speaking the truth to power get you? This is, from a theoretical perspective, this is not trying to change, this is not confronting power, this is speaking the truth to power. There's a website that says, if only Americans knew, which is based on exposing what the American tax dollars are used for, that a lot of American citizens aren't aware. And the assumption is that once you know, then things will change, because power is, or the powers of authority. Authority is responsive to people being aware and demanding change. Certainly, it doesn't work that directly in Palestine or Israel. There are other bigger forces like Zionism at work, chauvinism, preferencing the land and the resources and everything in it for one group of people over another group of people. So it's not just about raising awareness. Raising awareness is important, but without a political and legal campaign, then it's not likely to go anywhere. You got to keep it up. You got to keep it up to educate the younger generations, but it won't have any traction because it's not as strong a force as the ones that it's trying to confront. So other ways of transforming the conflict. BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. That seems to be having some effect in the sense that the State of Israel is now planning through different state bodies how to counter the campaign. There certainly is a case for boycotting Israeli products, as these people have done in Scotland. In the UK, we can grow few things, but we can grow potatoes. So why on earth are we importing potatoes at all, much less Israeli potatoes that are grown with water that's taken against the will of the Palestinian people that they share it with? not to mention the Jordanian, Lebanese, and Syrians, who are all part of the Jordan River. I could also talk about the broader conflict as well. So this is what Tony Allen calls virtual water. It's the water that was used to produce these in Israel, now exported and consumed in the UK. There are similar campaigns against Jaffa oranges, not because of the water content, just because of the food sovereignty types of issues. But there is a water element to this, and that can have some effect. But you're also going to have, any campaign will have to counter the liberal representations of the conflict. Liberal in the American sense of liberal, saying that, you know, there are no problems, everything's going quite well. It's not perfect, but we can tweak it a little bit and it'll be fine. So you've got the civil administration newsletter, for example. The civil administration is the Israeli occupying authority in the West Bank. So this colonel is in charge of, was in charge of water for the occupying authority of in the West Bank. And he apparently was really concerned about working with the Palestinian Water Authority because water is a fundamental aspect of human existence. Not water is a fundamental human right, but it's a fundamental aspect of human existence. So that's a representation of there is no major conflict, that Israel is actually keen on helping the Palestinians develop water resources. Just recently, just last year, 6 months ago, Trump's envoy to Israel managed to get the Minister of Water of Palestine with some Israeli water authorities to reach a deal over the Red Dead, which I can go into some detail if you would like me to. But the long and the short of it is that it's not a deal at all. It's just Palestinians agreeing to buy more water without raising the issue of Palestinian water rights or their legal entitlement. But it's hailed as an agreement, and it gets a lot more press than anything I'm going to say tonight. And people end up with the idea that things are on track. There are a lot of work by environmentalists too. Really important work for the environment, trying to improve things for biodiversity or to restore the Jordan River, but often avoiding the political angle. So talking about water for biodiversity, but not for people. So I can't really classify EcoPeace that bluntly. They do talk about water rights of Palestinians as well. But the attention that's drawn on all the minor successes that they've had in restoring parts of the Jordan River or getting people to work together on water conservation issues overshadows the conflict. So that in lots of venues that I go to, in lots of fora that I visit, people say, I thought Palestinians and Israelis were getting on, that the water issue is just a technical one, and we can buy our way out of it. And that's certainly not the case. So any transformation of the conflict will have to confront the liberal representations of the conflict, as well as the much more chauvinistic ones that say Palestinians don't deserve water. Okay, my last section is seeing how water is used as a political tool. And this came about after I've spent so much time looking at water in this context as an international issue, applying international water law, talking about an international conflict. And I'm beginning to question whether that was even right from the very beginning, and whether it's not more accurate to look at how water is being used as a tool for political or military ends. It's normal to use water for political ends. In Alabama, they were going to withhold water supply to illegal immigrants. So Mexican people who are already working and contributing and living in the US could be denied water. That might be a good way to send them back. Each of these headlines was taken just from one day in 2011. So Israel is doing much the same with Israeli-Palestinian villages in Israel to Israeli citizens, right? Palestinian Israeli citizens. Or to Israeli urban Palestinian citizens or Palestinian Bedouin who are also Israeli citizens. A great way to gather people, to force them onto settlements, or to evacuate, to get them, to lead them away from settlements. So now just wrapping up, and back in the West Bank, if you can control 9 drops of every 10 that fall onto territory, you have a great tool for coercion. And you can use that tool for peace, to promote your version of peace on your own conditions, perhaps to something that's sustainable or desirable, perhaps not. Or you can use it to transfer populations. If you deny water to the Palestinians who are behind me in this picture, for example, they will leave. Or if they don't leave, their children certainly will not stay on the land. They go to the cities, or preferably outside of Palestine, to Luxembourg. And if you provide water to the right people, then they move in and they stay, and they'll stay for centuries. So it's a really effective tool for the colonization project of the West Bank, and it's working quite well. So I think now that it's certainly, after such a long perspective that I've had on this conflict, it's more accurate to view it like this rather than in terms of an international water conflict, and that we should get down to the roots of the coal face, or the sharp edge of the conflict, which is about how water is being used for population transfer. And that, and then if we want to talk about interstate cooperation that comes from that, that would be welcome. The first and foremost would be doing the people here who are suffering from the control of water, or the expulsion from the land. We'd be doing them a favor first, or they would actually benefit from it much more than from any international legal analysis. So I'll end there with a few websites and a vote of thanks again to Martine and Moh and everyone for hosting me. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions.
Donc, oui.
Thank you very much. The first thing that struck me as you began was, what about the effects on this already existing inequitable situation, the effects of global warming, and perhaps, is there, you said there Ramallah has more rain than London, all right, but there is a Negev desert. So is there any sign of increasing desertification? Is there a change that will, as there is in so many other parts of this sort of middle area of the world where there's a slow in rainfall? I just want to ask you that, because of course that would exacerbate this already increasing pressure on water resources. Thank you.
Sure. And I work at a university that has a lot of excellent climate scientists, so I go to them on these questions. And there seems to be convergence of several climate models that say there will be drying trends in this part of the world, if you look from the Eastern Mediterranean onwards through to Iran, and also a shift in the rainy season, and a shortening of the rainy season, and more extreme events. So none of that is good news for the people who live in the region. If you look closer to it, though, along the very shore of the Eastern Mediterranean, so along Israel and Lebanon and Syria, that particular weather is influenced so much by weather patterns over the Mediterranean that it's not at all clear whether that slice of the very western edge of that area that I just described will be affected in the same way. The honest truth is we're not sure. We don't know. But another way that the climate change is affecting the stress or the water conflict is by people who use it as an excuse for not sharing water. So I think that if we think there will be less water, then that's a better case for sharing the water that we have equitably. But the opposite is the argument that's used, saying let's not talk about water rights. There isn't enough water for everyone anyway, which is more or less true. And it's getting worse. So let's buy our way out of this. Let's desalinate, and let's not talk about water rights. And so it's used as a smokescreen to avoid the political issue. Most of the people who use that are people who are promoting the Zionist view of things, and the status quo, which is wholly in favor of Israel. You got to wonder if the narrative would be different if it was Palestinians that controlled 9 drops out of every 10, whether they would still be blaming climate change and not Palestinians in that case. So, yeah, climate change probably isn't going to help. We're not sure, but I wouldn't blame the issues on climate change. It's men, it's humans who make these decisions, and these are the people we should be blaming.
Est-ce qu'il y a une autre question?
You explained so well how you can, through water politics, also bring the people you want to a place, or throw the people out that you don't want. There's another side of the water politics, that's the wall. You didn't talk about the wall which is illegal and which is not on the 67 border for most of its trajectory. There is one place in Kalkilia, I think, where the wall enters the Palestinian territory very deeply, I think 22 kilometers or something like that. And that's also the place where the Western aqueduct has the most richest water reservoir. Yeah. I remember when I was in Jayous, which is a village with very huge olive trees, like kilometers and kilometers, and famous for being very good olive oil. But their trees, they are now on the other side of the wall. So the wall is not, it's also a very big strategy how the wall is built. And the water is also one aspect of this, a very important aspect, I think. Maybe you can comment on this.
Sure, yeah, and a great point. Thank you very much. The wall, as you said, doesn't follow the border of the West Bank, and it does go several kilometers inside of the West Bank to ensure that it doesn't close settlements in with the Palestinians. So, at first, I did think, though, the positioning of the wall was all about water as well, because it does seem to follow the aquifer alignment to a degree. But I actually, and that would be an interesting story to tell, but the way that the groundwater works, actually, because you can pump in Israel or in the West Bank by protected wells and draw the water across underneath the ground, the wall actually has no effect when it's just sitting on top of the ground, because all the groundwater is passing underneath. So you can, hydraulically, you can just suck all the water out from underneath the West Bank or from beside the West Bank. As well as, I think the much more effective controls are the Oslo II agreement, what the PLO consented to in 1995, right? The Palestinian Water Authority, to this day, more than 20 years later, is still stuck and following the rules that the PLO agreed to in 1995. And that's an effective measure of control, much more, I think, even than the wall. Although the wall is destructive in so many other ways, because it cuts people off from farms. From a water perspective, it's not even necessary to maintain the control. But yeah, it should be taken down just for a number of other reasons. Totally.
one or two comments, maybe. The first one, it's about history. If you look at history, already in the 19th century, the first settlers, and especially the first Zionists who went to Palestine, had an eye on the water resources. And all was about that. They understood that if you want to establish yourself and you establish colonies, you need the water. So their first aim was to get hand on the northern part of Palestine. So it's not by chance that today we have the problem of that unbalance of water distribution between Israelis and Palestinians. It was right in the policy of settlement there for more than 100 years. The second comment is about the technology and the skills of the Israelis in the water sector. And the question to you, isn't that a little bit overdone, that reputation? One of the brands of Israel is, of course, they turned the desert green. So they must be very strong at that. You mentioned the technology of drip irrigation. From what I learned is that it was discovered by chance that someone saw a pipe in the soil, and the pipe had a hole, and water was dripping out of the pipe, and there was a tree or something growing out of these drops getting out of that defect pipe. And the guys had the idea, well, that's not stupid. If you put a pipe in the soil, now a plastic or an iron pipe, and we drill some holes in there, simply speaking, would be a good idea, of course. Then we take a patent on that, and we sell it to humanity. That's what happened. Of course, you have to change your patent every 10 years or 12, because the patent comes to an end. So is that a big performance? I'm not sure. You mentioned desalination. Desalination became popular when we had the membranes. For modern desalination, we are not talking about evaporation, but about membrane, the reverse osmosis. Relies on membranes, relies on chemistry. Once you have these membranes, it's a matter of pumps and pipes. We agree on that, it's obvious. So the big contribution of the country of Israel, I can't really see it. They use it, of course, they use it to their advantage. But their big contribution to that, I can't really see. Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree with practically everything you said, and certainly that the degree of control that Israel has is not by chance, and it started originally with the first settlers, absolutely. And on technology, I think that drip irrigation is so widespread now in Lebanon, Jordan, and the West Bank, as well as Israel, and further afield. Under certain conditions, it does make water use a little bit more efficient, but there are all sorts of technical problems with it, as you say, and it's certainly not better than furrow irrigation or other types of irrigation technique under certain circumstances, which we can get into. There are debates about irrigation efficiency. And on desalination, I hope I didn't give the impression that desalination is a good thing. I think desalination is something you reach for when it's proof that you've mismanaged your own water resources. You know, if you, every country in the Mediterranean now, every single country is desalinating for parts of their population, usually for wealthy urban centers. Israel's doing it on a much grander scale, over 400 million cubic meters per year. It's now to the point that even this past winter, which was pretty dry, when the Lake of Tiberias drops, and there's the usual concern in Israel that there isn't enough water. That concern didn't exist this year because they're producing so much water from membrane, well, they're through reverse osmosis technology. But that's not, I think that's a sign of weakness, because now they're locked into this desalination. It costs so much, and the main cost is for the energy required to push it through the membrane. It costs so much for these private companies to produce it, and Israel, the state, has agreed to purchase it at a certain price, which means they have to produce that much water 24/7, 365 days a year, which means if it rains too much, then they won't have enough people to sell it to because there's a cheaper supply. And so all of a sudden there's too much water in Israel, and this is a problem. So some of that irrigation, some of that desalination water is actually used for irrigation, which is a really expensive way to grow carrots or herbs or green peppers that we buy here in Europe. And the technological advance that Israel did that I mentioned was the remineralization of desalinated water. When you push water through this membrane, it's the opposite of sweating, it's the opposite of osmosis. You leave behind all the salt, and you have 70% salty water and 30% practically pure H2O, which you wouldn't give to your infants because it has no minerals in it. It has no calcium or magnesium or all the wonderful things that water has in it naturally. And you also can't grow with it. If you irrigate with pure H2O, as Israel started doing, you get these misformed tomatoes and what have you. And so the technological fix was to remineralize, so to add calcium and magnesium into this H2O, which is really a backwards way of doing things, and certainly a sign that things are not well managed. I think the amount of desalination that Israel is producing now is one of the reasons that they're so keen to sell to Palestinians now. It's because it's a secure market for all this surplus water. Now there's almost too much water because they have to keep producing this because the state is locked into these agreements with these private contractors. Which was the Palestinian position in 2008 at Annapolis was based precisely on the fact that Israel would reach this point. Back in 2008 at the negotiations table, there was barely any, well, there was one plant in Ashkelon that was producing 100 million cubic meters per year. And the idea was that to distribute the water, the fresh water, equitably and reasonably along the lines of international water law. And the benefit of that was that the impact wouldn't even be felt by Israeli society because you could phase in the redistribution of fresh water along with the introduction of desalinated water so that no one in Israel would ever wake up and turn their taps on and find them dry. No, you could replace the fresh water that you would resolve the water conflict with. So I'm against desalination. I think it's a sign of failure, but it could have been used, and it could still be used as a way of resolving a political conflict. There's so much water about. What is the rationale now for not sharing the fresh water equitably and reasonably? And there is no rationale, and of course that's a problem. It's not a rational situation. It's an ideological situation. There's a gentleman behind you, Sari Salam, who's doing his best to get desalinated water into Gaza. Did you want to say something about that, Sari? Because Gaza needs some water. And my former students, so I can put them on the spot.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mark, my teacher, my professor, supervisor, and my friend. Well, actually, as you said, desalination could be a possible tool to help a political situation. For example, in Gaza, it basically depends on the aquifer, on the coastal aquifer. As Mark said, there is less keen from Israel on it because they are not impacted directly. However, for the Gaza population, there's a huge problem. We are overpumping from the aquifer. We have already overpumped from the aquifer amounts for domestic as well as agriculture use to the degree that there's a huge amount of seawater intrusion phenomena that basically turn the aquifer into high degrees of salinity to the degree that you cannot even wash your face with, not only to drink or to have a shower. You cannot use it for any daily purpose. On top of that, there is the sewage infiltration into the aquifer itself, which also cause other health problems. The bottom line of this water, bad quality or horrible, let's say, quality of water that's affecting industry, the economy, the agriculture sector, as well as health sector, we try to find solutions for it. We try to, as Mark said, if there is a possibility for, again, agree on a fair share of the water resource that was unfortunately blocked. And based on that, there were a couple of studies with the USAID, with the World Bank. Currently also the EIB is involved in that. The European Investment Bank is involved with that now, is how to avoid this problem, how to avoid the catastrophe. There's a report by the UN that by 2020, Gaza will be unlivable area. This desalination project came as the main intervention or as part of a main solution to the water crisis by providing or by producing a 55 million cubic meter, which is basically the same yielding of the aquifer. In addition to other interventions, meaning hopefully reuse of wastewater, treated wastewater, managing or better managing the water resource, increasing the revenues of water collection, reducing the leakage of water networks, etc. It's in a critical situation now, yes, that Gaza is on all aspects on the shelf of collapsing, and people are trying to look to this project as a possibility for avoiding a bigger disaster for 2 million people in Gaza, a disaster that also could impact Israel directly, or I don't know where to put 2 million refugees. I think there is no place in Europe or Luxembourg. They are Gazawis, so they are a bit difficult. They will not cross the Mediterranean. They will try to cross the surrounding areas. So it is crucial, at least from the lens of the technical perspective, or even Palestinian Water Authority, as Mark said, they are considering it, let's just get whatever we can. And despite that, they are not even making their life easy to get that project through. So, yeah.
I think there was one more question.
Oui, merci pour votre présentation qui était vraiment passionnante dans tous les liens qu'elle a fait entre l'eau, bien sûr, les dimensions politiques, historiques, etc. Je voudrais vous poser une question par rapport aux politiques européennes en la matière. La BEI, la Banque européenne d'investissement, a son siège ici à Luxembourg. Il y a quelques années, avec certains de mes collègues, nous avons visité de hauts responsables parce que nous avions appris que la Banque européenne d'investissement avait repris un certain nombre de projets de soutien à l'eau en Israël, donc des projets en Israël. Nous nous sommes un peu informés pour pouvoir éventuellement poser quelques questions impertinentes, n'est-ce pas? Donc, cette eau que vous allez soutenir, elle vient d'où? Lorsque les Israéliens ont cette eau, d'où vient-elle? Et puis, à qui vont-ils la faire servir? Est-ce qu'ils vont la faire servir à toute la population israélienne et palestinienne d'Israël, aux Bédouins, etc. etc. Nous n'avons pas été mal reçus. Nous avons été bien reçus et nos questions devaient être transmises aux techniciens qui, sur le terrain, doivent vérifier l'application de ces projets, que ça respecte bien certains critères. Nous n'avons jamais eu de feedback vraiment intéressant. Nous n'avons pas forcé, bien sûr. Mais êtes-vous un peu au courant des projets que l'Union européenne soutient dans le cadre, je suppose, des accords d'association entre Israël et la Palestine sur le genre de soutien et le genre d'utilité que peuvent avoir ces projets, pour qui, pourquoi, en Israël aujourd'hui?
En bref, non, je ne suis pas au courant, mais ça m'étonne qu'il y ait une banque européenne qui investisse dans un pays comme Israël, et surtout en eau, parce que c'est une ressource tellement contestée. Et vous avez bien fait de demander ces questions. Et s'ils vous ont envoyé aux techniciens, c'est une ruse, hein, c'est normal que c'est normal de dire que c'est une matière technique. On va rechercher l'affaire et puis on vous reviendrait et ça, évidemment ça continue. Mais ouais, ces questions, pourquoi investisserons-nous dans l'exploitation d'une ressource qui est contestée avec un autre peuple? Même la Banque mondiale a des operational guidelines. Eux, ils ne vont pas investir dans un projet sans l'accord de tous ceux qui sont affectés, sur le Nil par exemple. Alors, je crois que la Banque d'investissement européenne devrait élever ses régulations. C'est bien fait.
Ça dépend de plus haut.
Oui, tout à fait, bien sûr. Ça revient toujours, c'est politique. Mais sans cette pression d'en bas, absolument rien ne changerait.
Yes. Just a quick question, because I saw this nice sentence that water is a basic human right. Was it this one? So just a general question. Can anyone tell me the price of water in Luxembourg? Yes. Thank you.
That's a great question. Nobody realizes how much effort the water engineers have put to get the water to your taps. They do it quietly. And it costs a lot of money.
You raised toward the end the issue of water as a political tool. And then you went on saying transfer of population. When we went to the region of the Jordan Valley a couple of years ago, we were explained what the population development in the Jordan Valley is. And we were told that before 1967, there were some 300,000 people living in the Jordan Valley. Today, Palestinians told us there are some 60,000 left. Only if you include the population of Jericho. So that showed the tremendous reduction of population in the Jordan Valley. And of course, the explanation is that the peasants have so huge difficulties to have access to water that they haven't anymore any perspectives for their farm, for raising their cattle and so on. They have to travel a lot to get access to water kilometers away, passing through checkpoints and so on, huge difficulties linked to that. That being the reality, the demographic reality on one side, and now on the other hand, if you see the policy of Israel, they have annexed East Jerusalem against international law. But now more and more you see the Americans giving kind of backing to that. They are less and less putting into question the issues of settlements, the Americans. They have now decided to move their embassy to Jerusalem. That said, and seeing the fact that the Jordan Valley is mostly Area C, under control of the Israelis, and seeing this development of population, Palestinians having to go away, could this development not be seen as part of a broader policy moving towards an annexation of Area C by Israel? And as a deliberate policy.
In short, I think, yes, absolutely, it's possible. And it's been openly discussed even in the Israeli Knesset, in the government, parliament in Israel, to annex the Jordan River Valley. Perhaps, I haven't heard about annexing all of Area C, but it's a logical conclusion. The Jordan River Valley is very, it's seen as militarily strategic because of, you know, in some terms it's called a buffer against Jordan, even though Jordan and Israel are at cold peace with each other. But certainly there has been talk about annexing all of that, and right now, the only Palestinians who are allowed in the Jordan River Valley are the people who live there. So it would take about 2 days, I think, to annex it, and I don't think there would be any resistance from either the Palestinian Authority or the international community. So I think the conditions are ripe for that to happen, absolutely. A few years ago, Ilan Pape was laying out the conditions about before 1948, before 1967, and this was 5 or 6 years ago when some Palestinians still had hope that the two-state outcome would be a solution. And he said, you have to be careful that the conditions are actually right for massive population transfer once again. If you demonize Palestinians and feed that into the discourse of, extreme Muslim terrorism or something, you associate all the Palestinian movement with that. And there's a shift towards nationalism. This is 5 or 6 years ago. And you get a right-wing government in Israel, for example, then it could happen. And we have all those conditions in place right now. So I wish I could tell you a happier story, but now there's good reason to double down on the resistance and then keep it up. But things certainly don't look good for Palestinian self-determination, let's say.
A short question. I understood that Palestinians, if they want to build a new well, normally it's never accepted because the Israeli military has to agree. How is it with old wells that should need to be repaired? Do they need also okay of the military, and do they get it?
Yes, that's an excellent technical question. Well, it's a question about repairing or rehabilitating existing wells. And all the wells that existed in 1967 that the Palestinians had built when it was under Jordanian rule, which were few because Jordan really didn't develop the West Bank at all during the period that it was in control. Those wells are old and need rehabilitation. But even to rehabilitate those wells, you need the permission of the Joint Water Committee, because you could be increasing the amount of water that the pumps can pump out from those wells. And so, but the Joint Water Committee is more likely to give the green light to a project like that than to the construction of a new well. But it's not always given, and it has to go through that same triple layer of technical, political, and military approval. So some of them will get backed because of political reasons or military reasons.
Maybe I have one last question, unless someone else wants to ask a question. It's about the private water societies in Israel. Like, I'm thinking of Mekorot. What is the impact of Mekorot on, or what is what do they actually do on the ground to take the water away from Palestinians in the West Bank?
So the water provider, the main water provider in Israel is Mekorot, and it's a state-run company. It's not privatized, unlike all of the UK, where I come from, thanks to Margaret Thatcher. And but it's a state-run company that has excellent technicians that are doing their job and what they're told to do. So I see them mostly as technical people who are doing the political paymasters' jobs. So if there's supposed to be a line built to supply a Palestinian village, then if the political decision is made, then Mekorot and the Israeli private contracting companies will go and build it. But they themselves, as an entity, don't have much influence. I don't think. But I could be wrong. I actually don't know very well how water decisions about water in Israel are made. Something worth looking into.
One possibility for the Palestinians to react in a modest way, as water has been declared now by the Human Rights Council in Geneva some 10 years ago as a human right. What you have explained to us this evening, I think for us it makes it very evident that we are witnessing a tremendous amount of violation of that basic human right. Could we not help the Palestinians to use this human right, basic human right, as a better tool, including to help them prepare and have them adopt it year after year, and outlining the violation of that human rights by tabling draft resolutions at the Human Rights Council in Geneva year after year, and outlining very clearly what the elements of that violations are, in order to develop a certain opposition to what's going on?
I think certainly the human right to water, if it were to be implemented, could improve the situation. And so therefore any lobbying around it, legal or political or public awareness, is a good thing. But a couple of things. First of all, it's already being done to very little effect, because it is easy to document the human rights violations, the human right to water violations. Different NGOs are doing it, and that's important. It should continue. But it on its own isn't enough. But secondly, and forgive me for always complicating things, but there is an argument that says lobbying for the human right to water is not in the state of Palestine's interests and not in the interests of most people. Because the human right to water is all about the amount of water, the argument goes, is about the right, enough water to live a life of dignity, which means drinking water and showering water, domestic water. It doesn't necessarily include the water for agriculture. So if whatever volume you think, you could calculate how many million cubic meters of year Palestinians would need to meet their human right to water. It would be, whatever, 80 liters per person per day times 2.5 million Palestinians. And that's well short of the amount of water that Palestine as a state needs because of the irrigation. The main consumptive use of water is for agriculture. And if you don't talk about water for agriculture, then it would be easy to meet everyone's basic drinking water needs, but not everyone's livelihood needs. And there's an economic concern there too. The GDP for irrigated produce in Palestine varies from 15%. The share of irrigated produce of the GDP of Palestine varies from 15% to 20 or 25%, which is a lot for the state of Palestine. So the state, as a state, would need, and the people, who are the farmers, would need to continue that, to have access to enough water for irrigation as well. And the human right to water approach might not give them that. But I'm not one to throw out the human right to water argument like some are, because I think it could actually improve one particular village's situation. And if it does just that, then it's enough. Because we don't even know how much we pay for water, but the Palestinians in those villages certainly do know how much they pay, and any extra drop, or certainly if you could secure their supply, that would be doing a good thing. So the human right to water might be good for that, might be useful for that.
Question, do you actually use social media to counter the liberal propaganda that actually Israelis and Palestinians are sitting down and talking and resolving all of it?
What's social media?
Facebook, Twitter.
Yeah, no. No, I don't. I'm embarrassed to say I'm a dinosaur already. I don't use Twitter or Facebook.
Because it seems to be a huge propaganda by pro-Israeli interests on those, on Facebook and Twitter. Any time that there is an issue, not just water, but any issue on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the pro-Israeli lobby is out in force and using rather spurious arguments as to why they're in the right and the Palestinians are in the wrong. And I'm just wondering whether how to actually counter that propaganda, and you know, especially in this particular situation where effectively the Israelis are stealing the water, if you don't mind me saying so, from the people who historically have the right to it.
Yeah, I think any means of raising awareness of the situation would be useful, and there are several Palestinian and Israeli and international organizations that do have social media campaigns. But just like any media, I think it's a tool that's more useful for some than for others. You know, we had big hopes in social media at the beginning that it would democratize everything, but it's clear that social media is sort of lining up the same way classic media has, and it's about the message that's being sent and how well it's received. If you want to present a message of hope or to, you know, cover a conflict so that so that the status quo is maintained, you try to normalize a situation that shouldn't be normalized. If you present that in a positive, liberal way, then that message will be received quite well. So it's more, I think it's more about the message than the means of communication of the message. If you say things have got to change, but we don't have a Palestinian government that can actually implement these changes, or it might mean some sacrifice on the part of an important political ally of several governments, then that's not a message that's as well received. So that doesn't mean we should stop saying the message. I'm just thinking, yes, we should use social media, but to the extent that it's actually useful, and without getting our hopes up and therefore prioritizing the other things, which is the actual messages or the actual truth, you know, in however you want to represent it. But if you're a Twitter fan or a genius on Facebook, then please, I didn't see anybody tweeting these pearls of wisdom that I've been throwing at you for 2 hours.
But even in traditional media, you've raised the issue of effectively propaganda.
Yeah.
Of actually saying that, you know, water is not an issue because Palestinians and Israelis sit down together and they resolve the problems, when you've actually shown clearly with the statistics that that's not the case. And there seems to be a huge issue there. And until that's resolved, the problem's not going to be resolved.
No, and you're dead right, and so it's not so much about social media, but you're dead right that it's, you know, addressing the liberal views that see things, that want to tweak things without challenging the chauvinism that's at the heart of the political conflict, which is Zionism, which is preferencing one people over another for all of the land and the resources in it. I'll put that in a positive way. That's what we should be addressing. And then apply it to water, to the people who've been displaced in 48, 67, to Jerusalem, to holy sites, whatever. Why on earth can such an ideology be tolerated and seen as legitimate in 2018? I don't see it as fair. But that's, you know, you're allowed to talk about certain ideologies, you know, Salafism, for instance, or different strains of Islamic fundamentalism, for lack of a better word, and those should be looked at, and considered and policies developed around. But you're not really supposed to look at Zionism. Why aren't we looking at Zionism and questioning why some people of a particular race, even though that's questionable, are preferenced over others?
Okay, so I think that was the last question. I want to thank you, Mark. Yeah, one.
No,
okay,
it wasn't.
well, it was not the last question.
J'ai encore une petite question. Vous avez dit qu'au niveau mondial, c'est les plus pauvres qui payent l'eau le plus cher. C'est vrai, je crois, les pays que j'ai connus, c'est comme ça. Je connais surtout le cas de la Bolivie, où il y a eu une guerre pour l'eau en l'année 2000.
C'est où ça, pardon?
En Bolivie.
Ah, ouais.
Mais c'est vous avez parlé d'autres pays aussi d'Afrique. Alors je me demande si cette répartition et cette utilisation de l'eau est tellement symétrique, c'est-à-dire si en Israël tous ont beaucoup d'eau, ou s'il y a une diversité dans la consommation et dans les frais pour l'eau, et si en Palestine aussi tout le monde n'a pas d'eau, ou s'il y a en Palestine aussi des différences. Ma question, c'est est-ce qu'entre Palestiniens et Israéliens, il y aurait peut-être des mouvements ou des synergies pour avoir, si jamais il y a une injustice en Israël aussi et en Palestine aussi, c'est pas la même chose pour tous, est-ce qu'il y a des gens qui se rencontrent pour créer des synergies politiques éventuellement pour l'accès à l'eau et pour un prix plus... Ou est-ce que c'est vraiment Israël comme ça, à 100% comme ça, et en Palestine, c'est à 100% comme ça la situation?
Non, c'est tout à fait le contraire. Vous avez très bien raison. En Israël, même en Israël, pour des citoyens israéliens, il y a une diversité, surtout pour les Palestiniens bédous, les Bédouins, qui eux, ont par fait de leur manière de vivre nomadique, ils se sont pas trouvés dans les villes. Alors, Israël a, bon, j'ai du mal à expliquer en français. So, thank you. So there is an issue of asymmetry even amongst Israeli citizens. The Bedouin are disfavored from the amount of water that they get. I think all Israeli citizens pay the same amount of water. But they're in the Galilee and in the Negev desert, there are attempts to settle the Bedou or attempts to push them away from different areas. So there are both attempts to provide water and to deny water and moving them about often. But I'm glad you raised the point of Palestine too, because yeah, I didn't focus on what's going on inside Palestine amongst the Palestinian Authority and the old class system that exists in Palestine that discriminates in a massive way against Bedou and against villagers in preference for urban elites. And that's also a massive problem. So your question, which was asking, are there people, maybe class warriors in Israel and class warriors in Palestine that could cut across the borders and not make the issue about about so-called Palestinian or Israeli water? That it doesn't exist, but I wish it would, because that's a movement that I would join in a heartbeat. I think that would be a beautiful movement. You know, whether you're Israeli or Palestinian or Bedouin or urban elite, you have the right and you should be getting as much clean water as everybody else. Yeah. But the class system in Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, is still very entrenched, and not many people are challenging it right now. It's usually subsumed by the national movement, which is typically led by urban elites, typically.
Okay, there was one more question. I think it will be a comment. It will be the very last one.
It's an honor for me. But I actually, Mark, would like to comment on 2 points.
Please.
The point of Mekorot that Moh raised, the technical relation with the Israelis, as well as the entry of materials and the political aspect. For example, the Gaza case, at least, it would have been much easier, less expensive in theory for the infrastructure to have direct link to the Israelis' water resources, either from desalinated land directly to Gaza. However, until now, the prices that are negotiated are very much high. So in the concept as water has been considered as a commercial good rather than being a right to water, even with the minimum price for operation. So that makes a big issue to the degree that the Palestinians and relatively the Israelis were pushing for the desal plant, for Gaza, for example, in order to have on a long run a cheaper cost of water. On Mekorot, for example, on the technical, the issue is that the project was supposed, or at least the overall water relation with the Israelis, we are hoping that it could aim to peace. So when you speak with the engineers on the Israeli side, they speak the same language. You feel, oh wow, it's easy to deal with them, but however, it's always bending on politics. So as much as we try to advance technically on issues, politics on the picture, that's blocking. However, interestingly, just for the last comment that has been mentioned by the gentleman there is currently a World Bank study for the tariff for the water sector in West Bank in Gaza. It will also take a focus on the Gaza desalination project to see the different society levels. Let's say the much vulnerable societies, how much they could and by how long they could start contributing to revenues. And let's say, it depends, of course, on the income, etc., etc. But this is very much complicated, given the non-institutional setup of the Palestinian Authority on that record. So, and thank you. Sorry for the last comment.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Right. So, I would invite you for a drink. Si vous voulez, je vous invite pour prendre un verre, voilà, juste à côté. Ah oui. D'accord, oui.
Ah, merci.